when, and we will go. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Groveland Council on Aging Ladies' Tea. We have a wonderful speaker with us this afternoon. I'll introduce her in a moment. I wanted to let you know, for anybody out there who enjoys volunteering, we have our newsletter collating that's going to occur on Tuesday. This coming Tuesday, I want to say the 24th, at 9 a.m. right here at Town Hall, and we will be bending, folding, and mutilating those monthly newsletters. We also want to say thank you to the Friends of the Groveland Council on Aging, who have been assisting us all year long in terms of programming, special events, and funding for our monthly birthday parties. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Kaylee Paré. She joins us from the Buttonwoods Museum in Haverhill, and her program today is going to be on early American life. Welcome.
Thank you.
Very nice.
So, as my introduction introduced, I'm here to talk about early American life, looking specifically at the colonial period in the greater Haverhill area. And a lot of the people and the events that I have to talk about today do specifically relate to Haverhill, but there are some larger themes. And as we know, Groveland was part of Bradford at one point, and now Bradford is part of Haverhill. And during the colonial period, they were all kind of mixing around with each other. So hopefully this applies to Groveland as well. So I want to start at the very beginning and talk about the Pennacook people, or the Native Americans that lived in this area before the English settled. The Native Americans from the Pennacook Nation lived and farmed in villages near the Merrimack River. The area was known as Pentucket, or Land of the Winding River in their Algonquin language. It was the language that was spoken by the Pennacook people. Both Native Americans and the early English settlers relied on the river, heavily on the Merrimack River for their food, transportation, trade, and water. The Pennacook people lived and farmed in villages near the Merrimack. They fished out of large dugout canoes called mashoons, or out of birch bark canoes, similar to the tiny one that I have to pass around here for you. That's birch bark. Yep, and I also have a piece of birch bark that has not been made into a canoe that I'll
Wow.
I love that.
So out of these either dugout mashoons or the birch bark canoes, they used nets weighted with small stones called plummets to gather the fish. I also have a net that I will pass around with you.
Oh, yeah.
Because if you're using a net out of a canoe and you throw it into the water, it's going to float on top. You need something that's going to weigh down at least part of it so that your net will stay in the water in the vertical position, and then you can catch the fish inside. So
Where
here's,
did they get that thread and stuff?
I know.
it's
What?
a local hemp, and they wound it and knotted it themselves into the nets.
Really? They did it themselves, huh?
So the net is coming around, and then the stone tools that made the net sink down on the bottom were these little plummets. It's a piece of stone that's been etched around the top part, and you can see when you get a little bit closer that there's a little bit of a groove right around the top, and that's where they would tie it to the net. So this is the weight that sunk the net down to the bottom.
Oh, it's heavy.
It is heavy.
Yeah. What kind of stone is that? It's so heavy. Oh, wow.
The fish that they were able to catch were used both as food and as fertilizer for their crops. So this is my little pretend sturgeon that I will pass around, because everybody knows there are sturgeon in Merrimack.
Did you say that, why is that little knob there?
That's been scratched into the stone so that it's easier to tie the net to the stone. They're just creating a little bit of a notch.
I have some odd looking piece of stone at home, and it's got a little knob on it. I've never known, I bought it in a shop in Marblehead, and they thought it was something fishermen used to mend their nets, but now I'm wondering if maybe they did tie the string around it.
I think both are
Show it to
possible.
everybody.
Yeah,
Nobody
when I was
knows.
seeing it, I'm not exactly sure, but I think both are possible.
What is this?
Here's the fish. The fish was food and fertilizer for their crops. I also have a few other tools that I'd like to pass around. I have a spear point or a projectile point. You can see that it's been flaked around the edges so that it's thicker in the middle and thinner on the the outside where you get that sharp edge.
What did they do with that?
Put it on
A
the end of a
spear.
spear,
On a spear.
Wow.
and
No,
I have
they-
an arrowhead.
They made these.
No repeat
did.
rifles for them.
So if you hit the flint, it's a flint type of stone. If you hit it at just the right angle, you
Flake.
can flake off pieces, and that gives you that thick in the middle, thin on the
Yeah, look at
outside
that.
where you get those
Heavy.
edges. And it takes a lot of practice to get it so that you hit the stone at just the right angle to get those pieces to flake off.
Wow.
They used to have people who just did this. Yeah.
And then the last tool that I have to pass around is the heaviest one, so there's your little warning when it goes around. But if you look at the top
Yeah.
part
Oh,
is
yeah.
kind of sharp. It's not terribly sharp, but it's been sharpened to that top part. And this would be one of the hand axes that they could use to dig out the canoes. Now, if you're making a dugout canoe or a mashoon, you chop down a tree, you light a small fire on one side, put it out, and then with this, you can scrape out the ashes, light another controlled fire, put it out, scrape out the next layer of ashes until you eventually get the right shape for your dugout canoe. This one is heavy.
Wow. What they did.
It must have been pretty strong. Well, yeah. Oh, that was smooth on top, huh? That's heavy. Be careful, okay?
That's what it is.
The water that they needed they needed every day for washing, cooking, and tending their crops also came from the Merrimack River. There were no roads before the 1600s, and so the Pennacook used the river as their main means of transportation as well. The river gave them the ability to travel long distances and trade with other tribes and with European settlers. In the 1600s, the Merrimack was navigable up through Haverhill. Prior to European settlement, it's estimated there were around 12,000 Pennacook living in the Merrimack Valley of present-day New Hampshire and Massachusetts. Epidemic diseases such as smallpox, influenza, and diphtheria spread across New England even before permanent European settlements had been established. English fishermen began to cross the Atlantic for cod and other fish starting in the mid-1500s. These fishermen set up summer camps along the New England shores, where they lived for a few months each year before returning home with their ships' hulls filled with salted cod. This seasonal contact brought diseases local native populations had no immunity to, wreaking havoc on native populations even before the Mayflower. By 1620, it's believed that there were only 2,500 Pennacooks surviving. Additional series of smallpox, influenza, and diphtheria ravaged New England throughout the mid-1600s, so that by 1675, the Pennacook population had fallen to only 1,200 people. And by the end of King Philip's War in 1678, the population had been halved again. By the 18th century, the surviving Pennacook moved out of the Merrimack Valley to join Abenaki communities in Maine and in Quebec. Descendants of the Pennacook are still living today with Abenaki in these areas. However, even though war and disease left Haverhill without its original inhabitants, much of their material culture has been left behind, including some of the stone tools that I brought out today. An archaeologist named Frederick Allenson Luce excavated Native American sites around Haverhill, Bradford, and Groveland around 1900, and most of his field notes, soil samples, and the discovered artifacts have found their home at the Buttonwoods Museum. Now,
What did the people look like?
early accounts say that they were all very tall. They had very long, black, beautiful hair, that they had very straight teeth, and they seemed to be free of a lot of the childhood diseases that most Europeans had come to expect at that time. So they didn't see a lot of natives in New England that had crooked backs or any other, smallpox, the pox signs on their face. They all looked very healthy, very strong, and very tall before
Yeah.
they succumbed to European
They
diseases.
must have eaten a lot of protein.
A lot of protein, but a lot of native plants too. So we know that they were growing corn, beans, and squash. And that was those three plants together are called the three sisters, and they were grown all over North America. Different types of corn, beans, and squash, but those three types of plants together will give you a fulfilling diet even if you don't have a lot of meat.
Oh, yeah.
And they had a lot of fish.
And a lot of fish.
Yeah.
The first Europeans to the area probably landed near the site of First Landing Park on Water Street in Haverhill, across from the Buttonwoods Museum, in 1640. Two of the early settlers, Tristan Kaufman and Reverend John Ward, came up the Merrimack River from Newbury, Massachusetts. Haverhill's oldest street is Mill Street, and it's across from First Landing Park. The first church was built in 1645, very close to Mill Street and First Landing Park. Before the church building was constructed, services were held under a big oak tree known today as the Worshipping Oak, on the grounds of the Buttonwoods Museum. And you can still see it, it's still standing today, it's right on the corner of our property, and we think it's between 400 and 600 years old today. The Pentucket Burial Ground, Haverhill's oldest graveyard, was set aside by town ordinance in 1660, right behind the first church. The church is no longer standing, but you can explore Pentucket Burial Ground today. The burial ground was most likely maintained by animals grazing, such as sheep, goats, or calves, because cleared land was very valuable. Many of Haverhill's oldest families are buried there, including the Wards, Whites, Saltonstalls, Ayres, Rolfs, and many more. The earliest graves are closest to the Water Street entrance, and the more recent graves are farther back towards the Linwood Cemetery. Now, in addition to talking to you about some of the general trends of life in the greater Haverhill area at this time, I'd also like to share with you some stories about some notable individuals. So the first one I'd like to mention is the Reverend John Ward. He was the first minister of Haverhill. And Haverhill gets its name because John Ward comes from Haverhill, England. It was his hometown. He arrived in Pentucket in 1641, a year after we were first settled, from Newbury, after his father Nathaniel was granted a petition to start a plantation, like he's in that, at Pentucket.
Oh, yeah.
John Ward's name appears on the deed to the city. And this is the copy, but we do have the original one. And there's also a better translation on the back. But you can see some of the original names, as well as the marks that the two Pennacook representatives put, because the Algonquin language is not a written language. It's all oral, so they had to come up with a mark to put down that they agreed to the deed.
We'll go past this.
So John Ward's name appears as the first name on the deed for the purchase of Pentucket from the Pennacook, who originally controlled the area. Local native people have been devastated by smallpox, and some sources claim that they considered the Pentucket area to be cursed. John Ward served for more than 50 years and was revered by local settlers.
Yeah, it's just interesting.
Life in the 17th century was different today beyond the obvious ways such as technology. Their worldview was drastically different than ours is today. It was closer to a medieval worldview because what we call the Age of Reason, where we got the ideas of John Locke and Thomas Jefferson, that government gets its power from the people rather than leaders getting their power from God. That hadn't happened yet. So we're still thinking that if you have rank and money and thus power, you have an obligation to care for the rest of the community. That is, as a result of your privilege of having that rank, money, and power, your duty is to care for everybody else.
Oh, no, that's I did.
On the flip
That's I
side,
did. Oh, yeah.
No, we're not against that.
on the flip side, everybody else has a duty to obey
Just
their
put an
betters.
asterisk in the
Yeah,
elderly.
yeah, I like that, yeah. I'm one of those villages.
So if you are not one with rank, power, and money, it's your obligation to obey those people that are your betters, the people that have it.
Hey, they can be.
Isn't that the way it is today
Just
anyway?
obey God.
Yeah.
We've had enough of that.
Communities within colonial New England, especially in frontier towns like Haverhill and Bradford or Groveland, were much stronger communities. Neighboring girls and women would help each other with chores, such as weaving, butter making, or baking, as each household needed them. So If your household needs help on baking day, a lot of younger daughters from other households would come and help you on baking day. But then when you're doing baking day, your daughters and others would come and help you on those days.
What a wonderful idea.
What happens on vacuuming day?
We don't vacuum, we just push the day.
All men between the ages of 16 and 60 years of age were part of the village militia. They were required to practice a few days a year for defending their town. Births were assisted by a midwife and all other women in the neighboring area. The other women would come to help with chores or childcare while the mother was recovering and spending some time with her new baby. With this in mind, I'd like to tell you a story about John Ward's daughter, Elizabeth Saltonstall. Now, John Ward gave the land adjacent to the burial ground in the meeting house, the land that's now occupied by the Buttonwoods Museum, to his daughter Elizabeth and Nathaniel Saltonstall on their wedding in 1663. Letters between Elizabeth and her daughter, about 30 years later, the daughter's also named Elizabeth, they've survived, and they showed the balance between Elizabeth Saltonstall sending her daughter first down to Boston to learn embroidery and then to sandwich upon her marriage to a minister down there, versus keeping her at home to help her with all of the chores that she needed to get done around the house. The Saltonstalls were considered to be one of those big families that had the duty to care for the rest of the community. So she had an extra burden within the household tasks that other families didn't necessarily have.
She only had the one daughter?
She only has one daughter that's mentioned in the letters. She might have had younger ones or older ones that had already gone away. Yes?
And where does the Saltonstall fit in? Who was the judge at the first, oh, you're coming,
He's the next
all right.
person I'm talking
Okay.
about.
Oh, all right, okay.
Why did you?
This is his wife. So during King William's War, in the late summer into the fall of 1694, the Saltonstall house was the garrison for the area. It was the brick house where all neighbors could come when Haverhill was under attack. The house was used as a refuge when Haverhill was under attack during the wars with the French and the Indian allies. Elizabeth wrote to her daughter of housing 60 people, lice, and Old Jersey, the cow, of staying in the house for 3 months straight.
Oh,
On the one hand, she has all this great help. She has 60 people, let's say half of them are women. She's got 30 women and girls helping her with all the chores. Other than the lice and the cow, it doesn't sound so bad. But then fall comes, the raids stop, the other families go home because they now have to take care of everything that they need on their houses and their farms to get ready for winter. So she loses all of her help. Her daughter is down in Boston, learning to be a pretty gentlewoman and learn excellent embroidery. And so another letter says that now Elizabeth is stuck at home without all of these other families, but she still has the militia in her house, which means now she is the only woman caring for about 14 men, including her husband and her sons.
I thought that was meant to be put to work.
After all of this, there's a letter that comes from her husband, Nathaniel, when he is down in Boston, that says she should come down and socialize with other pretty gentlewomen. Well, she writes back to him to say, I have enough to do cleaning up the mess that your militia has left in my house. I will not be going down to Boston, and he doesn't write after that.
She didn't need any additional chores.
Elizabeth's husband, Nathaniel Saltonstall, was a well-respected gentleman in Haverhill. He came to Haverhill in 1663 to marry Elizabeth Ward. They settled on the land that had been given to them by Reverend Ward. This was the beginning of the Saltonstall seat in Haverhill, with Saltonstall serving illustriously for decades as defenders of Haverhill and as public servants. The mansion was in the same area as the Buttonwoods house, but the house that we occupy today was built by the Duncan family in 1814. Nathaniel Saltonstall was a graduate of Harvard and considered popular and principled in military affairs, regardless of what his wife might have said after the militia was there. He served as town clerk from 1679 to 1686. He was a colonel of the Essex Regiment and was later a member of the Governor's Council. He resigned from his appointment to the court of Oyer and Terminer in 1692 as he could foresee the injustices of the witch trials. After he left the court, he himself was convicted of being a witch. Unfortunately, he could do nothing to stop the witch trial mania. He could only remove himself as a participant. A letter from one of the other justices suggests that Nathaniel Saltonstall was particularly troubled by all of this. His associate wrote to inform him that people were starting to take notice of his excessive drinking and that he should pull himself together. During King William's War in the late summer into the fall of 1694, this was the time that we talked about with Elizabeth Saltonstall. His house was the garrison for the area. Unjustly, the town censored him after the 1697 raid on Haverhill 3 years later because he was in charge of defenses, but there was a lot of devastation during that attack. 27 people were killed, 13 were taken captive, including Hannah Dustin. And I should have passed this around when I was talking about some of the women's work. I have a knitted sock
Uh-huh.
that I will pass.
My God.
Oh, goodness.
I also have the wool carders that you would use to make the wool. And I'm not very good at this.
Big what?
You need to make the wool kind of start to take this little snake-like shape with the wool carders where you kind of rub it back and forth. Once it's in this position, you can start to put it through the spinning wheel to get the yarn to knit the stocking.
It's still on my
So they
grandma's.
created those patterns.
And so I'll pass these around. Just be careful, these are sharp if you put too much pressure on your hand.
Now that really is from way back when.
This is a reproduction.
These are reproductions.
There are certain companies that we can buy reproduced historical materials for using hands-on.
It was not easy.
No.
Did you say this was actually made?
No, it's
Oh,
not a
that,
reproduction.
neither, okay.
And again, I have another reproduction. This is a spice grinder.
1893, Curtin Carding Company. Be careful.
They were wooden, huh? Yeah, they would have to be as a pattern.
Oh, look at that.
And then
What is
I
that?
have candles.
A pesto. Is that what you call this? Pesto.
Yeah,
Like you
oh,
crunch.
yeah.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
How cute is that?
Yeah, but that was just for the what, spices?
Spices. So if you buy a larger amount of spices from your general store, and it's probably come from India, and it's come up from the ships from India up the gondolas, those flat bottom boats that came up the Merrimack to deliver goods, goes to the general store. You buy it at the general store. You then have to like scrape off your cinnamon. You have to grind it yourself, or your nutmeg, or whatever you're doing. And if you're doing something, cinnamon and nutmeg you need to scrape, but other spices you probably need to pound.
Mm-hmm.
And then you could do just a little bit, just what you need at a time.
Thought they had to make everything.
Candles, they're from tallow.
Candles. Oh, I like the other, I like the other one of these.
I actually don't have the other one.
Wow.
Someone might have made it for us as one example to
Those
show.
would make your feet sweat though, I think.
They'd be good in the winter though.
No, I just bought wool socks and they made my feet sweat so much I could eat foot. I said, well, keep your feet warm, he said, so I put wool socks on
What
them.
kind of an animal does nylon on your shirt?
Huh?
What kind of an animal does nylon come on?
I'm not sure about that. It's a silk country.
Oh, yeah, do you
Nylon,
know?
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that doesn't come from, she just be funny.
This is what you do at the wool from the sheep.
I would do it.
You wouldn't have had a choice unless you'd chosen another job. You all had a special job, I don't want to have that.
Most of the people that were living in this area, because we were so far removed from Boston or Salem or those other port towns in the 1600s, most of them were basically living on homesteads. They're small farms, they're producing what they need, they're only getting a limited amount of
They share
goods
what
that are
they
coming from other places. So you probably did a little bit of every kind of job.
How did
My
they make the
grandfather,
candle?
when he had
It's
slaughtered the pig,
boiling the tallow,
would share with the neighbors.
from,
and they shared.
animal fat, mixing it with, no, that's soap, sorry. I actually don't know how to make candles.
Beeswax?
Soap is mixing
Well,
animal
make
fat
soap
with
with animal fat
ash
and
and
lye.
lye
They
Yeah.
have
and
a rag,
boiling it
they
until
give
you,
the
and
rag
then letting it, yeah.
Yeah.
with the strings.
Yeah, I
You
just-
zip the whole
Beeswax.
thing until the.
Is it bees?
From the bees.
Oh, they could
Well,
use
yeah.
beeswax, I don't really know. I wouldn't go after the bees, they hurt.
You're right, I think it was the lye that you find in the
Well, they use lye
ashes.
for soap, I know that.
Yeah.
And
Soap.
he did- Yeah, they made,
Yeah,
put
but
lye in
what's
A
soap.
bunch of dirty things
I
in the
thought
pot, make
that-
something that will get you clean.
Yeah, take the skin right off.
Yeah.
Boom. Oh, yeah, because they have something to use for skin something.
How do you make
Yeah,
it?
yeah,
Well, a lot of times you can make, those don't look like beeswax though.
No.
Those
oh,
are
and the
beeswax.
bayberry candles that are made with the little waxy berry, it's the bayberry.
I'll have to look into it. I actually
You
don't know
have
how
to
to
look
make
in, you better
candles.
find out, 'cause somebody else will ask you.
Yeah, because the,
Maybe I shouldn't.
I've forgotten, she'll find it.
How old are those things?
Again, these are all reproduction. So Hannah Dustin was a Haverhill resident and a famous New England captive. She was captured in 1697 during one of the many raids on this frontier area. Contemporary sources tell us that on March 15, 1697, a group of Pennacook Indians arrived at her husband Thomas Dustin's farm and captured the 39-year-old Hannah, her 50-year-old nurse Mary Neff, and Hannah's newborn daughter Martha, along with a number of other captives from the Haverhill area. Hannah and Mary were forced to march approximately 60 miles north to the intersection of the Contacook and Merrimack Rivers near present-day Boscawen, New Hampshire. Hannah and Mary ended up with a family of 12 Pennacook on an island in the Contacook. Under the cover of night on March 30th, Hannah, Mary, and a young boy named Samuel Leonardson, who had been captured years before from Worcester, killed 10 of the Pennacook, including children, while 2 escaped. Hannah, Mary, and Samuel then scuttled all the canoes but one and escaped down the Merrimack. After rowing a short distance, they decided to turn around and take the scalps of the 10 dead Pennacook
I heard
that were there, and then they continued homeward.
Mhm.
Hannah was declared a heroine in her time by her descendants and many others since. A statue to her still stands in downtown Haverhill in GAR Park, as well as one on the island of her captivity in New Hampshire. The one in New Hampshire was the first statue erected in honor of a woman in the U.S. However, beginning in the 19th century, she has also been declared a villain for her violent actions and condemned as unworthy of such praise. Members of the Dustin family are buried in the Pentucket Burial Ground. However, controversy remains as to where Hannah is buried.
Did you say Hannah and her nurse?
Yes.
Why did you live with her?
She had just given birth about 8 days before she was taken captive.
Yeah.
So Mary Neff was a matron in the community who was staying with her to help care for her and the new baby, and was still living with the Dustins when the attack came.
Wow.
So she wasn't a nurse in the sense of Hannah was injured and she was being taken care of so much as she was the helper within the house because she had the baby. So have many of you heard the story of Hannah Dustin
Yes,
before?
I have. Yeah, we had somebody come here that told us.
Have you heard about her sister Elizabeth Emerson?
I think she did mention it, I can't remember.
I don't think you can really consider Hannah's story without thinking about her sister Elizabeth's story as well. Elizabeth was Hannah's younger sister. She was born when Hannah was 8 years old. By the time Elizabeth was 20 years old and a likely age for marriage, Hannah had already been married for 8 years and had given birth to 5 children. Elizabeth, however, had her first child, a daughter named Dorothy, out of wedlock. She claimed that a local man named Timothy Swan was the father, but the charge never stuck, and she continued to live as a single mother in her parents' house, an act that was considered almost unthinkable in the late 1600s. In the spring of 1691, the neighbors suspected Elizabeth of being pregnant once again. On May 10th, a delegation of local people came to the Emerson house to question Elizabeth. The men in the party found 2 small infants buried in a shallow grave in the garden. While Elizabeth told the women inside, including Mary Neff, the woman who was eventually taken captive with Hannah a few years later, that she had given birth to two children in the night in the trundle bed at the foot of her parents' bed. She claimed the infants had never drawn breath and that she hid them in a chest until daylight when she buried them in the garden. Despite her assertion of innocence, she was further questioned by Nathaniel Saltonstall, the local justice of the peace and former resident of the site of Buttonwoods. Elizabeth was eventually charged with infanticide, killing her own children, convicted by a Boston jury in 1691, and she was hanged in June 1693, 5 years before Hannah and her captivity and her story happened. Now, violence of various kinds was more common in the 17th century, whether it was the unusual cases of the Emerson sisters, or the physical punishment coming from parents or employers, or the threat of attack from the French and their Abenaki and Algonquin allies. During Queen Anne's War of 1702 to 1713, French, Abenaki, and Pennacook, or from the Algonquin Nation, from Maine and New Hampshire attacked Haverhill in what is today known as the 1708 Bloody Sunday attack. Between 30 and 40 people were killed or captured during this early morning raid on Sunday, August 29, 1708, including Haverhill's second minister, Benjamin Rolfe. The Rolfe House stood near present-day City Hall in Haverhill, where a stone still marks the site of his death. Reverend Rolfe and his wife Mehitable and their youngest child Mehitable were killed. His slave Hagar hid 2 other children and herself in the basement under tubs and other objects. One of the surviving children, Elizabeth Rolfe, eventually married Reverend Samuel Checkley of Boston, and their daughter, Elizabeth, married the patriot and Governor Samuel Adams.
Oh my gosh.
They married in 1749. Another town leader who was killed on Bloody Sunday was Captain Simon Wainwright. Wainwright was the first mentioned trader in Pentucket and a leading merchant. His daughter, also named Mehitable, married. A lot of Mehitables were referred to as Hitty in family record, like the
Hitty or Heidi?
Hitty, Hittie.
Oh,
Hitty sounds
wow.
better than Mehitable.
There was a book when I was a child, Hitty, the first 100 years, it was about a doll. Yeah, Mehitable. Yeah.
Mehitable, I've never heard that name before.
Good Lord, no.
I think it went out of
Out of
fashion in the 1700s. Most of the ones I found have
Yeah, but
been
there's a rule, you can
16
read a lot,
and
you know, about history, you generally come up with that name, you know, all these weird names, I've never heard that before.
How did that name?
I have.
Hitty, her first 100
If I was
years.
named
I guess-
Mehitable, I'd like to be
It
a
was a
boxer
book, one
or a
Yeah.
wrestler. I'd be the formidable Mehitable.
award for the year. It was a story of a doll.
So Captain Simon Wainwright's daughter Mehitable married Richard Saltonstall, the son of Nathaniel and Elizabeth Saltonstall, in 1703. Wainwright and the Saltonstalls gave Mehitable and Richard land upon their marriage. During the Indian attack of August 29, 1708, Captain Wainwright was most likely killed by first fire against his bolted door. His wife surprised and confused the attackers by opening the door and welcoming them inside. Come on in.
Okay.
You want some money? You want some food? Let me go get that for you.
Yeah.
In the other room, she escaped with all of her children except for one, while she was in the other room confusing the attackers. The one daughter that did not escape was named Mary, and she was taken captive. We know that there was a petition to the General Court of Massachusetts to pay the ransom on Mary, but what we don't know is whether it was ever paid or whether she was ever returned. There's no record of that. John Hartshorn lived from 1650 to 1738. He was a gravestone carver who lived in Haverhill for most of his adult life, and he carved at least 25 gravestones that are in the Pentucket burial ground. He also carved stones in Bradford, Rowley, Newburyport, and Salisbury before he moved to Connecticut. He was a stone carver, a farmer, a soldier, a weaver, and he changed his styles over the years, but in the Pentucket burial ground, there are many stones that show his use of line and geometric patterns such as rosettes, bells, or wheels. He's known for creating the Merrimack Valley or Essex County style of colonial grave carving. Many of his carvings were requested after the 1708 raid on Haverhill, and during that raid, he lost his wife, Johanne, or Johanna, we're not really sure, there's been 2 different spellings, and 2 of his grandsons were also killed. During that raid, he got a call for 14 stones, as well as 9 backdated stones during the year of 1708. And that was his most significant year of stone carving. He eventually moved to eastern Connecticut with his daughter Martha Ladd, and he died there as an orphan.
Do you have any pictures of what he carved?
I did, but I have them on PowerPoint and my flash drive in my bag.
Oh.
Well, no, I just wondered
Maybe
because
we-
I live in Rowley and I could look, I go into the cemetery quite a bit, I could look and see if there's,
Yeah,
What
that's
they
a
look
good
like.
idea.
I'll see if I can
Charlie,
come up with a way to show you.
did you make a copy of the disc?
This is the John Ward House.
Could you make one?
It stands at the Buttonwoods Museum, and I'll pass this around for you. Reverend John Ward, as I mentioned before, was the first minister in Haverhill. In this house, the older part, which contains the kitchen of the house, we think was built between 1710 and 1720. When it was first built, that was the only part of the house. The room itself is not even as long as the table, and it's probably about as wide from the door to the wall.
It wasn't 4 bedrooms, 3 baths?
It was not. It did have a small
No.
loft upstairs, but it's a very small house.
This was built in 2 parts.
Yes.
Is
So
that
the
what you just
second
said? I'm
the second
sorry.
half of the house was built about 100 years later, and we think that was at like a parlor, a place
You
for
had
the
to cut
family
the
to
trees
gather or
down.
to welcome other people.
yeah, you have to take the trees down, your house would be very small.
That is
There is a central chimney in the house. On the kitchen side, it has a very large hearth. It's probably about 2 or 3 times the size of an average fireplace today. And that was the hearth where the family did all of their cooking. It has a crane. It's a metal piece that's attached to the wall. So if my body is the wall, my arm is the crane, it swings out.
Oh.
So you don't have to actually lean over the fire in order to stir a pot or look in and see what's going on. You can pull the crane, stir your pot, put it back on over the fire. We also have a beehive oven, which is shaped like a beehive, but it looks a lot like a tiny little brick pizza oven today. And that's where the family would do bread baking or make baked beans or other pastries or things inside the beehive oven. Now the house is called the John Ward House, but the name is a little bit deceptive. John Ward never actually lived in the house. We don't think it was completed until after his death, but the house stood on his land, and so that's how his name came to be attached to it. It was later used by tenant farmers, both for John Ward and then later the Saltonstalls, his daughter and her descendants. And then we think also by the Duncan family, who eventually built a house where the Saltonstall house used to stand, and that's the house that the Buttonwoods is occupying today. We think that the hearth was built around 1810, probably around the time that the addition of the parlor was added. And we use the John Ward House to teach early American life at the museum. It's filled all with reproductions, reproduction tinware, redware, ceramics, furniture, as well as reproduction quilts on the inside. And we do still use the hearth for hearth cooking programs. We'll make applesauce or Johnny cakes or a hasty pudding in the hearth with a lot of visitors to the museum.
You didn't want to.
Johnny cake.
Yeah.
Who says that anymore?
No, I know.
And my mom would
I lived
make
in a house in
them.
Salem that had a crane,
Mm-hmm.
but it was more or less a normal
I
fireplace.
cooked
It was
over
a
a
large
house. I
fireplace.
cooked
There
over
was
in
something
Ireland.
behind
Yeah.
the
Yeah, when I was in, when we were staying
The
in
fireplace was blocked, so I didn't.
north of,
yes.
Yeah, very old house across from Salem
Castle Coop.
Cemetery.
A lot of the technology in the hearths changed over the, like I've seen, if it's before 1730, they probably didn't have a crane. And then the size increases, so if yours was before the 1810 mark, it might have been smaller but still had the crane.
Yeah, I think
Ours was a little bit bigger and it has the crane. It was as the technology was changing.
Well, somebody said it was one of the few remaining houses after the big fire they had in Salem, so
I don't know when the big fire
it
was.
was very early, but it was interesting.
I like using it, it's fun. Between 1735 and 1737, a throat distemper epidemic hit Haverhill and 256 children died. And that actually counts Haverhill and Bradford, and in the Bradford number that includes Cleveland in this time period. Many of their graves can be visited in the Pentucket and the Bradford burial grounds today, and their stones are easily identified because the children were given smaller headstones than adults during this time period. So if you're ever walking around a colonial graveyard and you notice that some of the headstones seem really small, it was probably for a child.
Yeah, wow.
In the 1740s, the Saltonstall estate planted sycamore trees, known as Buttonwoods, on their property. The trees were planted by Haverhill's first Irish immigrant, a servant of the Saltonstalls, named Hugh Tallant. The Saltonstall seat was located where the Buttonwoods Museum now stands, up until the American Revolution. Now, legend says that during the Revolution, the Saltonstalls, particularly Richard Saltonstall, was loyal to the English crown, and the rest of the town didn't like his political leanings. And they got rowdy and threatened to burn down his house with his family in it. And
nice.
quick thinking, Richard Saltonstall sent a whole bunch of money down to the local tavern so that people could get free food and free beer, and they decided to get drunk and not burn down his house, and the family was able to escape in the middle of the night.
Oh,
So after that,
wow.
the Saltonstall house was unoccupied. It fell into disrepair through the American Revolution until about 1814, when James Duncan purchased the house. He was a local merchant that had interests both in Haverhill and up in Londonderry, New Hampshire, and he bought the property, built a new house for his son Samuel and his new wife Mary White Duncan, and that's the house that the Buttonwoods Museum is still in today. It's the big red house if you've driven down Water Street. Now, the last person that I'd like to mention is Dr. James Brickett. He was a physician and a soldier during the Revolutionary War. He was born on February 16, 1738 in Newbury, Massachusetts. He married Edna Merrill in 1759 in West Newbury, so we're getting a little bit closer. In 1762, Dr. Brickett established his medical practice in Haverhill. Shortly thereafter, he was recruited to be a surgeon's mate during the French and Indian Wars. And then on September 5th, 1774, he was the captain to lead the Haverhill Artillery Company and later the 10th Massachusetts Volunteer Regiment at the Battle of Bunker Hill. He was wounded at the battle in his foot, but he continued to take care of other soldiers, even though he himself had a musket ball stuck in his foot. So he led the Haverhill men during the Battle of Bunker Hill. On April 19, 1775, he led the Haverhill militia down to Cambridge after the call for Lexington and Concord. We were a little bit too far away up here to make it down to Concord in time for the battles of Lexington and Concord. The alarm call that came through didn't reach our area until about noon, which was already after the battles had happened that morning. But if you think that Paul Revere left Boston at about 10 or 11 o'clock the night before, and he was spreading the word, and then those guys were getting the call, and they were spreading it, and so basically there was this web going across eastern Massachusetts with the call that says, the regulars are out, we need to muster. It took from 11 p.m. on one night, and it takes all in Boston all the way until noon to get up to our area. So it was an efficient web. It got the word out everywhere, but it took a while to get to us. So we missed the battle, but after we got the call, the militias from our area went down to Cambridge to set up and then eventually participated in the Battle of Bunker Hill. After Bunker Hill, James Brickett eventually he continued to be a surgeon in the Continental Army. He was at Bergeron's surrender at Saratoga in 1777, and he was placed in command of his escort back down to Cambridge, where the colonial forces were gathering with Washington in Cambridge. And he lived in Haverhill. He was eventually promoted to Brigadier General. He's one of the first Brigadier Generals from our area. And he lived out the rest of his life until his death on his house in Water Street.
Wow, thank you. That was so
That was quite interesting.
Wow.
So I know that's a lot of information, a lot of people, and a lot of dates, but can I
It's
answer any questions?
fascinating. What was the first thing you said?
Native Americans, the Petticook.
You did a very, very
Nice
nice
to
job.
very good.
Thank you.
What about the Neff person? What's the person's name?
Mary Neff?
And does she have you said a statue?
No, Hannah Dustin
Hannah
has a
Dustin
statue.
has
Mary
a-
Neff was captured with Hannah.
Okay.
Hannah seems to get all the credit.
Oh,
Oh.
well, I was told from one of my aunts that I'm actually related to that particular Neff.
Very cool. I'm actually a descendant of Samuel Leonardson, the boy that was in the story.
Oh, 1600s in the family.
Maybe you guys are related.
Our ancestors were friends.
Yeah.
Yeah, we pray together.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's it,
it is fascinating. I love hearing
yeah,
history.
yeah. I've cooked though, I've cooked a whole meal and a half
Yes.
when I was in Ireland.
She doesn't have a picture.
Bread and everything, we did the bread
Yeah,
and,
I was
you know.
my aunt gave it to
The
me.
only
I
other
am-
thing that I didn't pass around was a colonial toy
Oh, I love
that I
those
actually
things, yeah.
I haven't mastered yet. It's called
Yeah.
a bilbo catcher. You're supposed to swing the ball so that it will land
Catch it.
either here
Yeah,
or you get the whole
Oh dear.
on it. And I haven't mastered it yet.
no, I wouldn't
How
know.
cute is
That
that?
was really
But if you
something,
think
huh?
like the kids today are always like on their
Oh, yeah.
electronic,
They'd be
if
able to
they're-
get it.
you know, if they
Yeah.
put enough time into it, they probably
Isn't
get it.
that
Yeah, I know I
something?
wouldn't get it.
And what is it called?
what we had.
It's called a bilbo catcher.
It's like golf,
Yeah,
you know.
They sell a
The
plastic one in
key.
the five.
I've seen them,
Yeah,
yeah,
I've seen 'em.
yeah, I have.
We
The
sell a wooden
ball
one at
is
our
That's
shop.
why.
It's like that batten board, you know.
How cute is that?
It's in
It
that
has
thing.
an elastic,
Yeah.
a string.
There's
Yeah.
another version that's called cup and ball that instead of having just that little bit of a
Yeah.
lip on it, it's got more of a cup and the ball is smaller, and I can get that one on.
Yeah, I was
Yeah.
gonna say,
I've got that
I
one,
know that.
but I haven't mastered the bilbo catcher yet.
Oh, that's
Don't even
all right.
bother trying. Probably hit myself in the head with the ball.
We've
What's
come a
Johnny cake?
long-
Johnny
God,
cake is like a
yeah.
flat pancake made of cornmeal.
That's all?
That's it. We think the name might have come because they were easy to travel with, so they could have been called journey cakes.
They were
at
called
some
journey
point.
cakes, isn't it? Well, at least I had read that.
Mhm.
Journey?
Journey cakes, because they could take them on a journey
Right,
because they
take
were
them with
easy, you know,
Sure.
and they would keep.
Yeah. Oh, my goodness.
They're good with molasses.
Sort of like a tortilla,
Kind of, yeah. They're a little bit thicker.
a little thicker.
More like the thickness of a pancake.
Can we send it back?
Instead of with wheat flour, it's made with cornmeal.
Paraffin wax is taken out of crude oil,
Oh.
and it becomes a white substance that they clean up, and that's how they make paraffin wax.
Yeah, but
Well,
those
that's
candles,
lovely.
they wouldn't have, no, they,
I
that's
don't
not
know
paraffin
about-
wax.
Colonial candle making.
It turned in slowly decaying plant material into crude oil.
Okay, and coal is slowly decaying plant matter too.
Yes, wood.
But I don't
It's like peat is.
understand.
Peat is
They extracted it out of the crude oil,
Yeah,
the
but it
white
wouldn't have had-
substance.
I'm guessing that it comes again from tallow, that it's related to soap
I would-
somehow.
Yeah, well, I
and
know
the
that
lye,
was-
the
I know that
ashes,
was
somehow or
lye.
other,
Yeah.
the ashes.
Yeah.
I
That's
think they
my
said
guess.
that the
I know
ashes
that,
and
yeah.
and it's
Because
very
the lye,
harsh.
the
Yeah.
soap,
Yeah.
yeah.
and somehow,
Very,
Interesting.
very
But
strong.
I
Do
know
you know
that
that
beeswax makes candles.
the candles were kind of a luxury item? You didn't burn
No, I
candles
did
all
this all
the
by
time.
myself.
A lot of times you get little bundles of beads and you would burn that. And you might drip a little wax on it to make it last a little bit longer, but that was more like a poor person candle
Yeah.
or your everyday candle.
We went to bed early, so they didn't need
Unless
the
it-
light.
unless it-
They did, yeah, but they didn't have the money
I like
to.
him that way too.
but you have to, but you have to
When
have
he's
the
like
beads.
doing the
It's
speech.
produced by the honeybee
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, okay.
for use in the manufacture of honeycombs.
Yes.
Beeswax is actually a refinement of honey.
The guy did the Robert
Okay, but I
Frost, what's his
believe
name?
that,
But those are beeswax
He's
candles,
good when he
because
talks.
At the
beeswax
Topsfield Fair,
candles
they
are
have a
rose,
demonstration.
yeah, but they, I
those are
Yeah,
thought
yeah.
that the original,
and tallow is
came
beeswax.
from England, they brought them over.
So if anybody is, comes up with questions later or is interested in visiting at the museum,
I'm
I
going to
have,
go up to the museum.
my business cards if you'd like to contact me.
Oh, how nice. I met a couple of girls who work up there.
Wasn't me.
No, it wasn't you, it was somebody else. Sorry. I went on a trip to textile museum. We went to see the wedding gowns.
The textile museum
I've
and
got a few more here than.
You got a lot there.
And they were on the trip. And they were.
That's a pretty card.
They said they volunteered there.
Oh, Kathleen
They tend to
Dacey
stick together.
might have been one
That
of
was
the
my
people
guess.
who was on the trip.
We had, a really nice conversation. Because somebody I know helped install the security cases at the textile museum. Because when it was being built, I got, because of them, I was in there, seeing how it was done, So it was kind of interesting. But I go there a lot, whenever there's something special, I try to get there, because it's a really nice museum. And these ladies said they worked at Buttonwoods, and I said, I've never been in there,
I've never even heard of it.
We
down the
were
road.
there.
We'll open for tours starting in May 1st. We have 3 historic buildings. We have the Duncan House from 1814 that's been connected to some more recent additions. There's a wing from the 1870s, there's a gallery from the 1920s, there's another addition from the 1980s. That's the main part of the building. We also have
This one here to take home.
the John Ward House, which is outside, and then we have a 10-footer shoe shop as well. Those 2 buildings, a 10-footer shoe shop. For making, before they built all the big factories downtown,
Just walk in front of me. Are you still filming?
Yeah, we finished, sure.
they were all over Essex County.
Yeah.
So the shoe shop and the John Ward House aren't accessible during the wintertime. There's no
Not
lights,
an
there's no
organize your
lights.
life.
It's hard to, we don't even shut them out, but on May 1st, we'll open for tours again.
I know, I'm going to go there. I will go this year because I'm really interested in
Is she from Tidy Trim?
And she's kind of interested.
Yeah, I want to go to the one where they have the shoes too.
Ladies, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Please know that you're welcome to take home some leftovers, otherwise you will have a very fat Council on Aging working with you.
Oh, yeah,
And to
like that's gonna happen.
We've noticed
Like
that.
that's gonna happen.
And to particularly thank Kaylee for her.
Yes, thank you,
wonderful
Kay, very
work.
much. Love it. Thank you. Appreciate it.